All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining today. If you can hear me, go ahead and pop a message in the chat so that we can get started. Okay, perfect. So today we are going to be talking about mastering your quantitative methodology chapter. That is typically chapter 3. So we'll be focusing just on methods today. On our website at statisticsolutions.com, we also offer a number of resources for the other chapters in the dissertation. We do provide consulting and editing for doctoral students with the very early stages of the dissertation. So, beginning all the way at topic development, all the way through to helping students put together their final defense PowerPoints. So if those are some services or some things that you need assistance with, please don't hesitate to reach out to us using the links that are in the chat. We also provide a free 30-minute consultation. So if you think you might need some help, but you're not really sure, or you want to hear more about the services that we offer, you can reach out to us for that consultation. And at that point, we'll talk to you about your research, hear what type of support you're looking for, and determine the best next steps forward. We do have research mentors, qualitative mentors, and quantitative mentors on staff. So we pretty much cover all of the areas that you might need help with in the dissertation. But again, today we'll be focusing on the methods chapter. So we will go ahead and get started. So the methods chapter is typically comprised of the introduction, research design, population and sample, instrumentation, data collection procedures, data analysis plan, limitations, and ethical considerations. One thing that's important to note here is that you should always refer to your school's template prior to starting to write. So this list is pretty exhaustive. This is typically what will go into the chapter, but every school differs. So there may be one school that asks for an additional component, or maybe a school that asks for less. So I always recommend reach out to your chair, reach out to your reviewers, or maybe even past students, and just make sure you know exactly what's required of you before you start to put your chapter together. So the purpose of this chapter is really to give a step-by-step instruction manual to other researchers who may want to reproduce your study. So in this section, you really want to break down and almost spoon feed the reader on the exact how of your research. So think of it as like writing a recipe or an instruction manual for those who are reading it. It should be written in a clear enough manner that they can read it and then go ahead and reproduce each of the steps that you've taken in their own study. And again, always check your school's guidelines just to make sure you know exactly what your requirements are as you begin writing. So similar to the other chapters in the dissertation, your methods is going to begin with a brief introduction. For all of the introductions in your dissertation, it's going to be very similar. You want to first reorient the reader to the purpose and the problem of your study. So you want to remind them why it is that this study is needed, why you're conducting this study. And then you'll also want to reorient them to your research questions. When you are restating your research questions, you want to make sure that you are restating them verbatim as they are written in other chapters in your dissertation. It's important that the language for your research questions maintains the same exact language, maintains consistency all throughout your dissertation to avoid any ambiguity or any confusion amongst your readers about, what you're studying or or what you intend to look at here in this study. So it may start to feel redundant just copying and pasting those research questions around, but it is the safest bet. So just make sure you're being consistent there. Then once you reorient the reader to your study, you can move on to preview what is to come in your chapter. So you might do that by writing out the section headings for the chapter. So you might say, in this chapter, I will review the data collection, recruitment procedures, population and sample, something like that. So just to give them an idea of what you're going to be talking about. Next, you are going to discuss your research design. So for this presentation today, we're talking about quantitative methods. So the methodology that you're going to be using is quantitative. If you are wanting to do a study that is qualitative or mixed methods in nature, we do have webinars dedicated to those two, so check them out. But today we'll just talk about the quantitative pieces. So once you get to the research design, you will want to identify the design that you're using by name. So that could be a correlational design, it could be experimental, quasi-experimental, whatever you've selected and whatever's most appropriate to test those research questions that you've outlined, you will want to go ahead and name it. And then you will want to show the reader that you understand what that research design is for. So to do that, you may want to explain what the features of that research design are, what are some of those hallmark things that make that design what it is, and what it is used for. And then in demonstrating your knowledge, you might also give some examples of other designs that you considered using for your study, and provide some examples for why you didn't use them. So for example, if you are doing maybe a correlational study and you consider doing an experimental study, you might say alternative research designs were considered for this study. For example, the experimental design was considered, but it was ruled out due to XYZ. So you are showing that you don't just know about the design that you're using, but you've really thought about all of the designs that are out there and have really thoughtfully considered what makes the most sense for your study. Now, when you're selecting this research design, you always want to make sure that it is in line with the purpose, problem, and the research questions for your study. So each design is going to do something different. You may be looking at relationships between two variables. You may be actually assigning participants to independent or dependent groups or controls. So you just want to make sure that you are really showing a clear thread for what it is that you want to do and why the design that you've selected makes sense for that. So I wouldn't recommend picking the design before you review your purpose and research questions. It should go in kind of a forward manner where the design is stemming from what you've already established as your purpose in your research questions. Once you do that, you will want to talk about the population that you are intending to study. So here it's important to think back to those early statistics classes and really remember the distinction between population and sample. So the population is the broad group of individuals that your results are intended to generalize or to make inferences about. So for example, if I would like to do a study to understand the experiences of women giving birth, maybe, my population is going to be women who gave birth in the United States. So in my methodology chapter, I would state that, and then I would provide some background about that population. So I might look into previous literature to see or maybe census data to see what's the age breakdown of that population. What's the average age of women who are giving birth? So you might think of some demographic characteristics that you can share about the population that you're using. Maybe you're doing a study of teachers. You can share the highest level of education among teachers in the United States or the area that you're studying. So these are some demographic characteristics that you might provide the reader with some examples so that they can really understand the population. And the reason that you want to do that is because specifically with quantitative studies, we want to make sure that the sample that you are studying is representative of that population. So you just want to make sure that they have some background knowledge that they can look at in order to make that comparison. Now, next, you're going to talk about your sample. So the sample is the people or are the people who actually participate in your study. So if my study is on pregnant women who give birth in the United States, more likely than not, I will not be able to survey all of those people, right? You can't access all those people. So instead, my sample might be 300 women who gave birth at a local hospital. So really going from that larger group and shrinking it down to what is accessible for your study. So once you've described that population, you will go on to describe your sample. If you're in the proposal phases, you're going to be talking about your intended sample. So this may be kind of theoretical. You'll be saying, I intend to recruit X amount of participants. Whereas if you've already gone through the proposal phase, at this point, you will kind of just be reporting back. You may be making some tweaks to that chapter to put it in the past tense to say, X amount of people participated. So you just may have to make some small tweaks. Here you're going to describe the sample. So you may want to, again, provide some characteristics for the people who participated in your study. And you'll also want to talk about your sampling strategy or your technique. So again, that sampling strategy should really be in line with the purpose and the research questions and what makes the most sense or what's most appropriate and defendable. So random sampling is the gold standard, but it may not make sense for your study. And I'll give an example of what that might look like. So if you are doing a study that requires you to have maybe individuals who had a specific experience, so like the giving birth example, it wouldn't make sense for me to maybe use like a snowball sampling or a different type of method. I might need to use a more purposeful sampling method to really identify people who are meeting that criteria. So these are just some things to consider. And in this section, you will describe the sampling method you used. You will want to provide citations for what that method is used for, what it does. And then through that, you will also want to describe how you recruited the participants to participate in your study. So this I normally see is an area where students might skimp a little bit. In that recruitment piece, you really want to be as detailed as possible. So starting all the way from maybe if you needed to, the permissions that you had to get at a specific site in order to recruit. So I see a lot of students doing studies involving teachers or hospital administrators. So if it's an organization that you had to go and request permission to recruit at that site, you'll want to make that clear and explain what that permission process was like. So maybe you met with the principal of a school and explain the study to them and ask them if you can attend a staff meeting, right? And then what is the next step? So not just describing the permissions, but really getting down to the nitty-gritty of how participants became engaged with your study. That could be that maybe you sent out a mass email, maybe you distributed flyers, maybe you posted on Facebook. Whatever it is for your study, just describe that process for how they became aware of your study and then how they became engaged. So once they found out about your study, what was the next step? Did they email you to get involved? Was the link to your survey embedded in that initial contact message so they could immediately participate. Whatever that process was, just describe it here. Now, if you have not gone through the proposal phase yet, since your sample size is kind of theoretical, you're saying who you think you might recruit. You'll also want to provide a power analysis to show that you know how many people you need to recruit in order for your study to really show that it's generalizable and it's appropriate for what you're trying to do. So you may need to calculate that as well. And we do have a power analysis calculator on our website, and we have some slides and webinars specifically related to that. So if you have some additional questions on power analysis, you can refer to those online. So once you've described that population and that sample, and also your recruitment procedures, you're going to get into the instrumentation. So with the instrumentation, you'll want to talk about the particular scales or instruments that you used for your study. A lot of times I see students using surveys. So if you are using a survey for your study, you will want to talk about why or when that scale or survey was developed, and cite previous literature for what it is used for, and also describe the instrument in detail. So how many questions does it have? What is the response scale? Is it yes, no questions? Are they responses on a Likert scale? Are they, well, I would say those two probably are the big ones. So really just describing what the scale looks like. And then also talking about the validity of the instrument. So how do you know that this instrument really tests the variable that you're trying to get at? So maybe you're doing a study of depression, right? There's a Beck depression scale. So that is a validated scale, and there's a lot of literature that shows that it's validated. So here's where you'll bring in some of those citations to show that you are indeed using instruments that test for the variables that you are wanting to study here in your dissertation. So you'll want to provide some of those validity and reliability figures like Cronbach's alpha. So those are just some things that you'll want to pull in as well from your literature. Another important thing to note here too is in the response scale and scoring, you'll just want to consider and kind of prepare yourself for the different data cleaning procedures that you're going to need to do to analyze the data, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So once you've described the instruments that you're using, so at this point you would have said, you might have said, my research purpose is to study self-efficacy among women who give birth in the United States. The population for that study is women who give birth in the United States. The sample that I'm recruiting for my study is 300 women at a hospital in Florida. That's where I am. And then you will say, to study the self-efficacy, I'll be using a self-efficacy scale, and you'll explain where that scale was derived from and the validity and reliability. So now that you've done all of that, you're going to talk about how you're actually going to collect the data. So will you be collecting that scale in person? Maybe you're going to be going around the hospital and handing out paper and pencil surveys. Will you be doing it online? So maybe you're sending out an email and individuals will go ahead and click that link and take your survey that includes your scale. Whatever you're doing, you'll just want to describe that, how and where that data collection will take place. And then you also want to talk about the consenting process. So depending on the modality, you will have a different process. If you are collecting your data in person, you might read the consent sheet to the participant and have them sign it. You might contact them over the phone and consent them before you even give them the instrument. If you're doing a survey online, the consent might be embedded into your survey. So again, whatever your process is, just make sure you're describing that here. And then if you're using multiple instruments, you'll also want to talk about the order in which the instruments will be administered. So just really clearly, survey 1 is going to be regarding self-efficacy. Survey 2 will be about depression. So really providing that lineup in a narrative format. If your study is not through primary data collection, so if you're doing an archival study, this will look a little bit different for you. And actually, I'm going to go back one slide. This also will look a little bit different for you. So if you are accessing a data set that has already been collected, so maybe something like NHANES or the YRBS, rather than describing the instrument here in the scale section, you might be describing like the data set that you have that you will be doing for your study. So you might want to describe when the data set was created, the types of questions that the data set asks, things like that. And then in this section, in the data collection and procedures, since your data is already collected for you, you will be describing or reporting back what those data collection procedures were for the researchers who created that data set, and also talking about the steps that you had to take in order to access it. So typically, if you're using something that's already been collected, there will be like a manual that explains how the data was collected. So it could be that there was like a survey panel or a nationwide survey and they called, every other house or something in the nation. So you'll just want to make sure you have a firm understanding of how they collected the data. And then again, outlining how you gained access to it. So and this is actually really important to be conscious of too, if you intend on doing a secondary study, because the process to access the data can be lengthy depending on where you're accessing it from. So as you are thinking about your methods and as you're planning, you may just want to look into what the timeline is. So I know, for example, the PRAMS, which is a pregnancy risk and monitoring assessment given by the CDC, they review requests for data once a month or something like that. So you'll just want to be aware of that as you are thinking about what data to use and what's going to be feasible for your timeline as you work on your project. So once you've identified that data set, you will talk about your data analysis plan. So here, the first step will be to talk about how you are going to get your data into an electronic format to be analyzed. If you did a paper and pen survey, that process is going to be a little bit more drawn out than if you collected just an online survey. So if you did use paper and pen, you may talk about, how you typed the information from the surveys into an Excel sheet, and then how you ensured that information was accurate. So maybe you had, a research assistant, or you had somebody quality check every other entry that you put in, or, whatever process you went through to make sure that you weren't adding typos or misrepresenting the data on accident as you were moving it over into an electronic format. Then if you did an online survey, you might just say, data was collected using Qualtrics. Once data collection was complete, the data was uploaded into XYZ software. So that's the next step. You want to identify the software that you're going to be using for analysis. So you could use SPSS, you could use R. It really just depends on the language that you're most comfortable with and the complexity of the statistics that you're doing. But you just want to make sure to mention the software that you're using. I think we have a blog post on our website that talks about different softwares. So if you're in a place where you're like, I have no idea what software to use, don't worry. We do have resources for that. So let us know if you have questions about that as well. So once you have identified that software, you want to talk about those data cleaning procedures. So depending on the survey that you're using or the variables that you're looking at, there may be some manipulation that you need to do in order to get your specific variables analysis ready. So for example, if you have two questions, I'll give an example of something that I've done. So I had two questions where I wanted to understand the length of maternity leave for women. And question one in the survey asked, how long is your paid maternity leave? And question two asked, how long is your unpaid maternity leave? So in order for me to analyze the variable that I really wanted to, I needed to take a sum of those two variables to create a new variable. So that is an example of a data cleaning process that you may need to do in order to get those variables ready. So anything that you do, anything like that, that changes what's already existing into the variables that will be included for final analysis, you'll want to describe in your data cleaning procedures. Next, you will talk about the descriptives that you will do. So for your variables, your categorical and your continuous variables, you may be taking the mean. Well, for the continuous variables, you'll be taking the mean, the standard deviation. You might be looking at the minimum and the maximum values. And then for your categorical variables, you'll most likely be looking at the frequency and the percentages for those variables. So you'll want to talk about those descriptives as well. Typically, what you'll want to do is take descriptives for your demographics and then also for your variables of interest, just to see what the distribution of those variables and those qualities are in your sample. So those are two things that you may do in terms of descriptives. Then you're going to talk about the actual analysis that you're going to do to answer your research questions. So each research question and each variable identified in those research questions should have some sort of analysis, right? In order to answer all the research questions, we have to do some type of analysis for it. So you will describe what that will be. So maybe you're going to say something like, to identify associations. Oh no, we'll say to identify differences in GPA among students who took the course online versus in person, we conducted a t-test, something like that. Now, once you've identified the particular analysis that you're doing, you also want to be conscious of the assumptions testing that you need to do in order to do that analysis. So, for example, in order to conduct a t-test, you need to have data that is normal, and you also need to test for homogeneity of variance. Those are two assumptions that you would need to test for. So in addition to describing the actual analysis, you'll want to describe how you're going to test those assumptions. So you might say, in order to test for normality, I'm going to look at a histogram of the data, or I'm going to look at the values of skewness and kurtosis in the data. Or you might say, in order to determine the homogeneity of variance, I'm going to run a Shapiro-Wilks test. So again, depends on your test, depends on your analysis, but you just want to make sure that you are covering each of these steps here in this section. Now, once you've gone through your data analysis, so you're explaining exactly how you're going to be analyzing the data, you are next going to talk about the limitations in your study. So specifically, you can talk about the limitations of your research design. This is something that I think is an easier section to begin with once you know the type of study that you're going to do, because this will not require too much interpretation on your end. There are established limitations for each research design and a lot of literature to back up those limitations. So this is something where if you are having a day where you're not feeling too creative with your writing, you're kind of just wanting to do a task that's a little less intensive, you can go ahead and start to write this limitation section based on information that's already there, right? You're not having to come up with it too much. So for example, correlational studies, one limitation is that you cannot, correlation does not explain causation. So you can't say that because of the correlation you found that, one variable is causing the other. So that's something that you may be able to, on a low motivation day, easily bang out this limitation section of the methodology chapter. And that goes for all of these different research designs. So if you're doing a survey, you may run into some social desirability bias where participants are responding to your survey in ways that, put them in a positive light. So for example, if you're asking participants, how much exercise do you engage in on an average week? They might say, oh, I run every day, and maybe that's not true. Maybe they're saying that because it sounds good. So those are some things that you might run into in terms of limitations. After you talk about your limitations, you're going to go into the ethical considerations. So typically schools will want you to talk about the principles that have been put forth in the Belmont report. Beneficence, you're going to talk about respect for persons. So these types of things that you get through city training, you'll want to talk about those. You'll also want to talk about your IRB approval process. So basically just stating that, this study has been IRB approved through your university's review board. Again, you'll want to bring in that information about the informed consent and how participants are providing their consent. So you may want to describe your consent form and talk about what is on there. So maybe things like participants are made aware of the study purpose, that their participation is completely voluntary, there are no consequences for not participating, particularly if you are conducting a study at your place of business. So if you work in education and you're collecting surveys from teachers at your school, areas where there is a greater potential for, what's the best word? Like strange power dynamics, maybe. So if you're like someone's supervisor, or if you're a teacher and you're surveying students, things like that, you really want to make sure you're talking about how you intend to, uphold these ethical considerations and minimize any potential risk to participants. You'll also want to talk about how you're going to maintain the anonymity and the confidentiality of participants and their responses. So how are you going to make sure that their responses are anonymous? You may be doing something as simple as just de-identifying the information. So instead of using participant names, you're going to use ID numbers. Something as simple as that can be described here as a way to protect those identities. And then also any standard operating procedures that you've established for your research amongst your team. If you have one, you can talk about those as well. And then lastly, you're going to talk about the data storage. So are you storing the data in a file cabinet under lock and key? Is it on an encrypted server in your office? Whatever that is, you just want to clearly get across here that it's not, you're not at Starbucks analyzing paper pen surveys at the table and, people can walk by and read the participants' responses. You want to make it clear that these are being cared for in a very protected way to ensure that you're respecting the anonymity of your participants. And then lastly, you'll talk about what you'll be doing with the data in the future. So typically you might say something like, all data will be destroyed after a time period of 5 years, or maybe after the conclusion of the study. Whatever it is that you intend to do, you'll just want to outline that as well so that they know that, this data isn't kind of just lingering in the world after the conclusion of your study. And that is the extent to the methods chapter. So here on this slide, we just have some information about statistic solutions. So again, we are a full service dissertation consulting and editing company. So if you are looking for some more one-on-one support, do reach out to us. We're here to help, and we are open Monday through Fridays from 9 to 5. So now I will open it up for questions.